The desert doesn't kill quickly, it waits, silently draining the life from those who dare to cross it. Under a blistering 47-degree sun, a man lies motionless on the burning sands of the Mojave, far from any trace of civilization. No water, no signal, no way out. Just when death feels certain, something stirs in the haze, a faint breath, a soft paw, and eyes that seem to carry memories. Was it real, or a dying man's hallucination? What unfolded next wasn't just survival. It was a connection between species, born not from words but from instinct, fate, and something far deeper. The Mojave Desert stretched endlessly beneath the blistering sun, a sea of shimmering heat and cracked earth. It was 117 degrees Fahrenheit, 47 degrees Celsius, and even the air felt like fire. From above, the desert looked like a painting of silence. No trees, no movement, not a single cloud in the sky. Just miles upon miles of sunburnt sand, rippling with waves of heat. And in the middle of it all, a man lying still. His name was David Harper, 60 years old, a seasoned photographer, once known for chasing storms and sunlight across remote corners of the world. But now he was motionless, half buried in sand, his shirt clinging to his sweat-soaked skin, one arm flung over his face as if to shield himself from the merciless sky. No one knew he was out here. No cell signal, no passing traffic, no rescue coming. The desert didn't roar, it whispered. Dry wind hissed past his ears, carrying grains of sand that bit at his skin. Each breath he drew was shallow, raspy, like breathing through cloth in a burning room. His lips were cracked, bleeding slightly. His water, gone. His gear, useless. Even the GPS device had died hours ago. This wasn't the kind of death that made headlines. It was quiet, drawn out, like a candle slowly running out of wax. Time seemed to bend, stretch, dissolve. There was no past, no future, only the now, the unbearable heat, the pain, and the slow unraveling of the mind. In his fading consciousness, David wasn't thinking of rescue. He wasn't thinking of his photographs, his career, or even his family. Just silence, the kind that gets under your skin and settles in your chest. The kind that tells you, this is how it ends. Then something, a flicker, a shift in the air, a shape, or just another hallucination? He couldn't tell. But in that moment between life and the abyss, something was out there, watching, breathing, moving toward him. And that, somehow, changed everything. His name was David Harper, 58 years old, retired but far from finished. For over 3 decades, he'd been a man of movement, scaling cliffs for the perfect sunrise, crawling through underbrush to catch a predator's stare, waiting hours in snow, storm, or sand just to click the shutter at the exact right moment. He wasn't famous. He didn't need to be. His photographs lived in the quiet corners of museums, magazines, and memory. They told stories not with words, but with light. Retirement was supposed to mean slowing down. But for David, it meant one final pursuit, one last journey, one last shot. He'd read about it in a science journal years ago, an elusive optical phenomenon that occurred only a handful of times each year. As the sun dropped below the horizon in certain parts of the Mojave Desert, it cast light in just the right angle to turn the ancient cliffs into liquid gold, rose, and deep violet. A moment where stone seemed to breathe. That was what he came for. David had planned everything with the precision of a man who had lived through his fair share of risk. 3 gallons of water, high-calorie rations, a satellite GPS, printed maps as backup, 2 fully charged camera batteries, emergency beacon, sun hat, survival knife, even a small notebook, just in case inspiration struck. He knew the route, he knew the heat, he knew the stakes, but no one ever really knows the desert. Because out there, even the best laid plans can crumble like dust. One wrong turn, one unexpected dip in the terrain, one moment of overconfidence. The wind could erase your footprints within minutes. The sun could steal your strength before you realized it was gone. Nature wasn't cruel, it was indifferent. And in that indifference, David would soon find himself at its mercy. As he stood beside his Jeep that morning, loading his gear, he looked out at the horizon with a familiar fire in his eyes. He wasn't chasing fame or even beauty. He was chasing truth, the kind only silence, solitude, and sunlight could reveal. He just didn't know that something else was waiting out there. Something far more powerful than any photograph could ever capture. It happened in seconds, the kind of moment you never see coming until it's too late. A sharp gust of desert wind tore across the sand, unexpected and violent. David's Jeep jolted slightly, tires shifting just enough to slip into a soft bed of sand he hadn't noticed. He hit the brakes, turned the wheel, but the front axle sank deeper. The entire vehicle tilted, groaned, and with a sickening crunch, rolled onto its side. Dust filled the air. One of the rear doors burst open, and his main water supply tumbled out, the heavy canister clanging against rock, cracking. Water, his most precious asset, spilled into the sand like blood into the ocean. Gone in moments. David scrambled out, coughing, disoriented. His phone? No signal. The GPS? The screen flickered, then went black. He reached for his backup device, cracked, useless. His camera blinked low battery. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, not yet, but from adrenaline. He knew panic was the real killer in the desert, so he forced himself to breathe slowly, to think. He stuffed essentials into his pack, whatever water he could salvage, a protein bar, his camera, the satellite locator he wasn't even sure still worked, and he started walking toward higher ground, toward what he hoped might be cell reception or a miracle. But the Mojave had other plans. The heat bore down like a living thing. The ground beneath him radiated with fury. 5 minutes felt like 20. 5 hours felt like a lifetime. His boots grew heavy, his thoughts slower. Time stretched like rubber, melting, warping. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. Sweat poured, then stopped. His body was no longer cooling itself. It was shutting down. The sun crept westward. Shadows lengthened, but hope did not. David's knees finally buckled. He fell forward, cheek pressed to the burning sand. He didn't move, couldn't. All that preparation, like all that planning, undone by one shift in the wind. This was how it happened. Not with drama, not with sound, just with silence, heat, and the slow, devastating realization that this might be the end. The world had begun to fade. David's vision blurred at the edges, shapes smearing into light, then dissolving altogether. The heat had drained him of everything, strength, clarity, even thought. All that remained was the weight of his body against the scorching sand and the deafening silence pressing in from all sides. His chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, each one a little less certain than the last. And then he felt it. Not pain. Not the burn of the sun or the sting of wind-blown grit. It was something else. Something soft, warm, damp. A presence. Something was touching his hand. He tried to open his eyes, but the light was too strong, the air too dry. For a moment, he thought it was his mind playing tricks, hallucinations, the kind they say come just before the end. He'd read about it. The brain, in its final minutes, offers comfort in the form of illusion. But this was different. He felt breath, real breath, against his cheek, rhythmic, close. He turned his head slightly and through a haze of heat and exhaustion, saw it, a dog, not a pet, not some well-fed companion with a collar and tags. This one was thin, coated in layers of dust and sand. Its gray fur clung to its bones, and yet it stood proud, calm, watching him with eyes that shimmered with intelligence and something deeper, something ancient, almost mournful. David blinked, unsure whether he was dreaming or dying. The dog didn't move. It stood just inches away, its head tilted slightly. Then came a sound, soft, restrained. Not a bark, not quite a whine, just presence. It stepped forward and nudged his hand again as if to say, "I see you. I'm here." David felt something crack open inside him. Was it real or some divine echo conjured by desperation? But in that moment, sun overhead, death circling close, and the desert as still as a tomb, David understood one thing with painful clarity. He wasn't alone anymore. And sometimes that's all it takes to bring a man back from the edge. The dog didn't bark. It didn't jump or tug or whimper. It simply turned, quietly, purposefully, and began to walk. After a few steps, it stopped, looked over its shoulder at David, and waited. That glance held more weight than words ever could. David, still barely clinging to consciousness, knew without knowing, if I don't follow, I die here. It wasn't logic. It wasn't strategy. It was instinct, raw, ancient, and undeniable. With muscles screaming and breath ragged, he pushed himself up, stumbling onto shaky legs. The dog continued, steady and silent, weaving through patches of scorched earth and wind-shaped dunes. David followed, half conscious, half guided by something deeper than reason. The sun was still merciless, but a strange kind of momentum began to carry him forward. Not just the will to survive, but the need to trust. 1 hour passed, then another. The terrain grew rougher, jagged rocks that burned through the soles of his boots, swirling dunes that shifted with every step. The dog never strayed far, Every time David faltered, it paused, waited, looked back, and every time, David kept going. He couldn't explain it. There was no clear destination, no visible sign of rescue. But the dog moved with purpose. It wasn't wandering, it was leading. Finally, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, bathing the desert in a dull amber glow, something appeared on the edge of David's blurred vision. A structure, weathered, broken. A fire station, abandoned long ago, half swallowed by sand. The dog stopped at the doorway, then sat, tail brushing the ground. David stumbled inside, barely able to lift his feet. The air inside was stale but cooler. Dim light filtered through a cracked window, illuminating dust and rust and ruin. And then he saw it, a dented metal barrel in the corner, covered in grime, lid rusted shut. With trembling hands, David pried it open. Water, not much, stale, but it was wet, real, drinkable, life. He sank to the floor, tears burning down sun-scorched cheeks. The dog curled beside him, not asking for thanks, not demanding attention, just there. And in that silence, David didn't question anymore. For the first time in hours, he didn't feel lost. He felt led. By the time David's breathing had steadied and the water had taken some of the fire out of his blood, the sun had begun its slow descent behind the desert hills. Golden light poured through cracks in the fire station's warped walls, stretching long shadows across the sand-streaked floor. The dog lay beside him still, unmoving, as if it had always belonged there, part of the place, not just a passerby. David stood slowly, legs still weak, but his eyes sharper now. Curiosity stirred beneath exhaustion. He wandered out the back of the station, stepping over rusted tools and forgotten debris until something caught his eye, a small mound just a few yards away, half covered in wind-blown sand. At first glance, it looked like part of the terrain. But as he approached, he saw the stones, carefully arranged, deliberate. Time had weathered the formation, but its intention remained. Someone had built this with care. Kneeling, David brushed away the top layer of dust and grit. A flat, time-worn stone rested at the head of the mound. The desert had nearly erased it, but not completely. Etched into the surface, faint but readable, were the words, "Max, my last and truest friend." His heart stilled. For a moment, the wind stopped. The desert hushed. Behind him, he felt a presence, the dog, still there, still watching, not pacing, not sniffing, just being, sitting in silent companionship. David turned and looked at the animal, suddenly unsure of what was real and what wasn't. Was this Max? Was this his pup, a descendant? Or something less explainable, a guardian spirit? A soul that never left? The dog didn't answer, of course, but it didn't need to. Its eyes, reflecting the last light of the day, held something deeper than understanding. They held memory, loyalty, love, ancient and unbroken. David felt a shiver despite the heat. He lowered his head, not in fear, but in awe. Here, in a forgotten corner of the desert, under layers of silence and sand, rested a story. One of friendship that had not ended with death. One that had perhaps found him, just in time. And somehow, he knew he hadn't been found by accident. David sat with his back against the crumbling wall of the old fire station, the dim light of dusk now swallowed by the thick velvet of night. The desert, once blinding and brutal, had quieted into a different kind of silence, cool, deep, eternal. He wasn't shivering from cold. He was shaking from something deeper, a release. And then he cried. Not from fear, not from pain. He had already passed those thresholds. What filled his chest now, and spilled out in silent tears down his dust-caked face, was gratitude, raw and overwhelming. Gratitude for being alive, gratitude for not being alone, gratitude for the strange, loyal creature lying at his side. The dog hadn't left him since that moment in the sand. Not once. It had walked with him, waited for him, led him to water, to shelter, and now it lay beside him like a silent sentinel, breathing slow and steady. Its eyes were closed, but its ears flicked at every subtle sound, ever alert. Not for danger, it seemed, but for him, for the man who had nothing left to offer but presence. David turned his head and looked at the dog. There were no words to say, none that would have meant anything. What could you say to a creature that appeared out of nowhere and chose for no apparent reason to stay? In that dark, wordless moment, David felt something shift inside him, a thread pulling tight between him and the animal, a connection forged not in comfort, but in shared struggle, in survival, in silence. No name had been spoken. No collar identified the dog. It had come with nothing but itself, and that had been enough. More than enough. It had stood between David and death, not with teeth or noise, but with unwavering presence. A living whisper of fate curled beside him like it had known him forever. Out in the middle of nowhere, on the edge of everything, David didn't feel afraid anymore. He felt understood. Whatever the dog was, wherever it had come from, it had chosen to be here, with him. And somehow that choice made all the difference. The desert was quiet again, but this time it wasn't threatening. It was still. A stillness that came only after survival. The night had passed, and with it the worst of David's fears. He had drifted in and out of sleep, his body heavy, his thoughts too worn to hold. But somehow morning had come, and with it a second chance. A faint blinking light caught his eye. He turned slowly, muscles stiff, and saw the source, his camera. One of the features he had almost forgotten about. An emergency beacon built into the newer models, designed to activate after prolonged inactivity and exposure to extreme heat. It was blinking red, steady, alive. He didn't move. He didn't need to. Somewhere out there, someone would see that signal. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. He couldn't tell, but the silence began to shift, just slightly. Then a hum, then distant voices. Crunching boots on dry earth, the rhythmic whir of a drone overhead. Rescue. When they arrived, David was too weak to stand, too hoarse to call out, but he was there, breathing, blinking back tears. One of the rescuers shouted his name. Another dropped to their knees beside him, checking his pulse, offering water. But their eyes kept drifting to the dog. The animal hadn't moved. It lay beside David, body low, muscles tensed, eyes locked onto the newcomers. It didn't growl, but it didn't wag its tail either. There was no trust in those eyes, only alertness, caution, protection. David placed a hand on the dog's back. "It's okay," he whispered, voice barely more than a rasp. "They're here to help." Still, the dog didn't relax. It stayed beside him like a final barrier between the man and the world, as if it had decided, until proven otherwise, that humans couldn't be trusted. And who could blame it? The rescuers looked at one another, unsure what to make of this silent, dusty guardian. But one thing was clear: David hadn't survived alone. He was broken, sunburned, exhausted, but he was alive, and lying next to him, equally silent, equally changed, was the reason why. He named her Hope, not because it sounded poetic, but because it was the only word that made sense. In a place where everything had been stripped away, water, strength, direction, even time, she had appeared. Not with fanfare, not with fury, just presence. Quiet, unrelenting presence. And somehow, that had been enough to bring him home. David didn't talk much about the desert afterward, at least not in the way people expected. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't sensationalize what he'd survived. Instead, he did what he'd always done best. He observed, reflected, and captured truth through story. Months later, he published a small book. Not a bestseller, not a sensation, just a humble memoir titled Hope in the Desert. The cover featured a black and white photo, the silhouette of a man and a dog walking side by side across cracked earth beneath a setting sun. In the opening pages, David wrote, "I used to believe that growing old meant growing smaller, that time would quietly erase meaning until all that was left was memory. But I was wrong. Sometimes at the edge of ruin, you find what matters most." The story resonated not because it was heroic, but because it was deeply human. It spoke to anyone who had ever felt lost, forgotten, or unsure of their purpose. Hope wasn't just the name of a dog, it became a symbol. A reminder that even in life's driest, most desolate stretches, something unexpected might still find you. Hope adjusted to life in David's quiet home slowly, but with a grace that suggested she'd always belonged somewhere. She'd just been waiting for someone to see it. She never barked much. She didn't like loud noises, but she followed David everywhere. From the garden, to the studio, to the porch, where they would sit at dusk and watch the light fade across the hills. He had gone to the desert chasing a photograph. What he found was a reason to keep living. And in the stillness of each evening, when Hope would rest her head beside his chair and close her eyes, David would sometimes whisper, mostly to himself, "I didn't save her, she saved me." If this story touched something deep within you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next powerful episodes. We have even more extraordinary animal encounters and life-changing moments coming your way. We'd also love to hear from you. What did this story make you feel? Have you ever experienced a moment of unexpected connection or rescue? Leave a comment below to share your thoughts, reflections, or even just a few words. Your voice helps us grow, and your perspective could inspire someone else watching. Let's keep this community heartfelt, human, and full of hope.